What is your first impression of me? Perhaps you've noticed that I'm a woman. Maybe you're drawing some conclusions about me based on the way I'm dressed or the way that I speak. But what you see and hear in front of you is just the tip of the iceberg. My name is Aimee Truesdale, and today I'm going to talk about looking beyond some of these initial assumptions. And I want to start with a story from my early career. I was working my first job as a nuclear physicist, and I had the opportunity to talk to one of the more senior men in my department. And this is a conversation that really changed the course of my life. Because this man said to me, "I don't think women's brains are cut out for science." I'll give you a moment to let that sink in. We'd barely spoken, we hadn't spoken about science, and he'd already written me off. Not only that, he'd written off an entire gender, about 50% of the population, as being bad at science. And so, inspired by that story, I'm going to take you on a journey all the way through the iceberg. We're going to talk a little bit about the science of assumptions, why making assumptions can hinder positive progress. And I've got a few pieces of advice for you on how to bust outdated stereotypes and look beyond the tip of the iceberg. So, I hope you've got your Arctic gear on. We are going to explore the tip of the iceberg, which is the bit that's above the surface. And scientists at the University of York in 2017 showed that it takes between 33 and 100 milliseconds to form an initial impression of someone. What people most often look out for when they first meet someone are trustworthiness, attractiveness, and dominance. And this kind of makes sense, right? Throughout history, it was really helpful to know if somebody was going to be a friend or a foe, if they might be a potential mate, or if you might be in danger. But scientists have also found that in modern times, these assumptions have become overgeneralized. They're no longer useful in their current form. So, what can we do about this? I start to think about my situation. What would have happened if I'd had the opportunity to show my credentials, to show the quality of my work before my colleague had made an assumption about me? It had very severe consequences that I wasn't given that opportunity. I actually ended up quitting my job. I actually left the industry entirely. And this leads me to my first piece of advice for you today, which is challenge those assumptions, challenge those initial assumptions. Now, I completely acknowledge that it might make sense to trust your gut instinct in certain scenarios, but if it's safe to do so, stop, have a think. Why am I thinking that? And if you're anything like me, you'll be surprised at some of the biases that you have. So we're going to carry on our Arctic journey, and I hope you've got a very warm, dry suit, because we're going to dive straight into these Arctic waters to see what lies underneath the tip of the iceberg. And to illustrate this part of our iceberg journey, I'm going to tell you a story from history. So in the 1950s, big symphony orchestras decided they want to change the way that they're going to recruit players. They start asking players to audition from behind a screen, so they could be chosen solely based on their musical ability and not on their appearance. And this had a really interesting unintended effect. See, the number of women in these big symphony orchestras was just 6% in 1970. By the 1990s, it was over 20%. And nowadays, it's more like 40%. So what can we learn from this? In removing the opportunity to make an assumption, it leveled the playing field for women, allowed more women to enter these jobs. And I wish I'd had that opportunity to prove myself to my colleague without him making an assumption about how I look or who I am. This leads me to my second piece of advice for you today, which is remove the opportunity to make an assumption if possible. How do we do this? Well, if you're hiring, think about using gender-neutral language in your job ads. Think about maybe anonymizing the CVs of candidates, taking out names, ages, locations, or anything that could prejudice you. And even if you're not hiring, in my workday today, we actually, when we have meetings, go around the room and ask each individual person if they have something to contribute. We don't assume that somebody's going to have the confidence to stand up and ask a question out of the blue. It's natural, it's human for us to make assumptions. And that's why, if we remove the opportunity to make an assumption, we allow ourselves to make better and more objective decisions. So we've reached the final part of our iceberg journey, and we're swimming in the murky waters of the Arctic underneath our iceberg. And I'm afraid this is where it gets a bit sinister. Because what if leveling the playing field isn't enough? What do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to use another example from history. And this time it's 1983. NASA are looking at sending the first American woman into space. And they have selected Sally Ride. She's very well qualified for the job. She's got a PhD in astrophysics and lasers. How cool is that? She's also got 5 years of astronaut training under her belt, so she is just as qualified as any of her male colleagues. And yet, when they have the pre-launch press conference, guess what kind of questions she gets asked? Will the flight affect your reproductive organs? Do you weep when things go wrong on the job? And those types of questions are not consigned to history. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, she was asked about things like her sex life and her appearance when she was doing interviews instead of her politics. Jacinda Ardern, Sally Ride, they were just as qualified as their male colleagues. Yet, they faced assumptions and prejudices that their male colleagues didn't have to face. They were their equals, but they weren't treated fairly. And this is the reality of what a lot of people face. A system that technically treats everyone as equals, but in practice has pitfalls for certain groups of people. And I'm not just talking women here. I'm also talking people from different ethnic groups, people from the LGBTQ+ community, or people with disabilities, just to name a few. You might be thinking to yourself, well, that's all very sad, but this is a societal problem. What can I do about this? And that's where my third and final piece of advice to you for today comes in, which is support visible representation. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take women in science as an example. It could be as simple as watching a movie, reading a book that's about women in science. If you wanted to go further, you could investigate and spread awareness of the contributions that women have made to science throughout history. You could also listen to and amplify the voices of women working in science today. You're contributing to that, you're supporting visible representation by being here listening to my speech. We know that visible representation works, and that's because children were asked to draw a picture of a scientist. When they did this study in the 60s and 70s, just 1% of children drew a woman. When they repeated the studies in the 90s onwards, 28% of children drew a woman. So we are getting the word out there, we are spreading awareness, but progress happens slowly. When my colleague said that fateful phrase to me, I was really upset. I was angry. Then I became determined. I became determined not just to prove him wrong, but also to get the word out there that we are more than what we appear on the surface. Please ever think about those 3 pieces of advice I have for you today. Firstly, challenge your assumptions. Secondly, remove the opportunity to make an assumption. Thirdly, support visible representation. We all make assumptions. That's human nature for us to do so. It's what we do afterwards that really counts. And you have the power to change things, not just for yourself, but for society as a whole. And so if you only take away one thing from this talk, I hope that the next time you find yourself making an assumption about someone, you stop and ask yourself, is this just the tip of the iceberg? Thank you.